Now, 80% of Americans have some degree of insulin resistance because there's so much sugar, right? We eat a lot of sugar, and eventually that creates insulin resistance, which eventually leads to or can lead to diabetes. It's an obesity epidemic in this country, as well as a diabetes epidemic in this country.
Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation. Welcome, everybody. My guest today is Dr. Brant Cortright. Dr. Cortright is a professor emeritus with the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's an author and a clinical psychologist. He has written 4 books, 2 #1 international Amazon bestsellers, Functional Psychology for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline, as well as the Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle. Dr. Cortright is a featured speaker at conferences and corporate gatherings on the topics of peak brain performance, cognitive enhancement, preventing cognitive decline, anxiety, and depression. He sees psychotherapy clients in his San Francisco office, and Dr. Cortright's orientation is holistic and integral, and he integrates the 2 major streams of depth therapy, contemporary psychodynamic and existential humanistic approaches, together with somatic and functional approaches to psychological healing and growth. So what are the brain health steps, that you've outlined? And I know you've got about a 4-step process that you've outlined that help, give people that hope that no, really, you can get new brain cells that are much better for you.
So I think of this as there's a big diet and physical brain health piece, and then there's also a psychological piece as well.
Okay.
So in terms of what I think of as the healthy brain diet, I think it consists of 4 different pillars: neurogenic, ketogenic or low carb, anti-inflammatory, and gut friendly. All 4 of these are involved with brain health. So neurogenic, first thing we want to do is try to increase the neurogenic rate. And most people can increase their neurogenic rate probably 5 times, probably more than that, with dramatic effects on how you feel and how you think. So again, both books go into probably about 30 different nutrients. Some of the biggest ones would be omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil, particularly DHA and EPA. Omega-3s consist of ALA, EPA, and DHA. ALA isn't terribly important. It doesn't really convert to the other 2. EPA is good and important, particularly because it is anti-inflammatory. And particularly in the brain, we want to reduce inflammation. DHA is super important because it is the fundamental building block of the brain. 2/3 of the brain is fat. And of that, 1/3 to 1/2 of it is DHA. So we need high quality DHA coming into the brain all the time. Most people need 3 to 4 grams of omega-3s every day. If you have high inflammatory levels, say if you do a high sensitivity C-reactive protein test,
Okay,
you are over 0.5 for a male or 1.0 for a female, that means you've got high inflammatory levels, and you do well to bring those down as much as possible. In that case, you'd like a 2-to-1 EPA to DHA in your omega-3. If you have good inflammatory levels, then you want 1-to-1.
Okay.
They did an experiment with monkeys a while back where they raised one group of monkeys on a low omega-3 diet and one on a high omega-3 diet. And when they looked at their brains, the low omega-3 diet monkeys had very simple, undifferentiated brains. When they looked at the high omega-3 monkey diet monkeys, they saw that they had very complex, richly differentiated brains, almost like humans. So in terms of childhood, but also in adulthood, probably the single most important nutrient is our omega-3s. There's a woman, Sandrine Thuray at the University of London, did research, increased neurogenic levels by 40% simply by adding omega-3s to the diet. There's other things. Blueberries, green tea is fantastic for increasing neurogenic rate, also anti-inflammatory. We want about the equivalent of 10 cups of green tea a day, but we don't want that much caffeine. Caffeine is more problematic, but they have caffeine-free extracts that you can get.
Okay.
Quercetin is great. Hesperidin also is super good. And the book goes into a number of these things to increase our neurogenic rate. Part and parcel with that goes stopping eating foods that lower the neurogenic rate. So, for example,
that was my next question.
Yeah, fried foods, for deep fried foods, French fries, fish and chips. I used to love fish and chips, but really bad for the brain. Those oxidized fats get into your bloodstream. They create high levels of inflammation. That inflammation just chews up the inside of your blood vessels. So we want to stay away from fried foods. We want to stay away from sugar. A high sugar diet will cut your neurogenic rate in half. That's pretty astonishing. You think of the diet of the average American child, for example. High sugar cereal, bad fats. It's a disaster for the developing brain. And what's interesting is that as this happened in the last 5 years, childhood rates, anxiety levels have gone through the roof, so have depression levels, so have Alzheimer's levels, 5 times what they were 50 years ago. Well, childhood rates of depression are 8 times what they were in the 1960s. Childhood rates of anxiety are 5 to 8 times what they were in the 1960s. And that's not through better testing. That's the exact same standardized tests that were used back then. Diet, glyphosate, all this has to play an important role in all of this. So those are some of the main foods to avoid for increasing the neurogenic rate.
Just Thrive products have superior survivability, designed by nature to make it to your gut intact and ready to go to work. The clinically proven effectiveness of Just Thrive products will drive your optimal health and protection. Whether it's immunity boosting or defense from pathogens, Just Thrive has the immune support we all need these days. Listeners can save 15% site-wide at justthrivehealth.com with promo code DITCH15. Now, just on the some of these avoidance foods, we're including, I guess I'm asking, are we including the processed foods? Because, when you talk about high sugar, it's not just the sugar, but all the other chemicals that include the pesticides, herbicides, glyphosates that are right in the food we're eating, just so people really recognize it's pretty much in everything you pull off the shelf that's been processed.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Processed foods are a disaster. Also because they have some of these bad fats in them, right? Like vegetable oils, seed oils. The fats we need to be eating would be things like monosaturated fats, like olive oil, avocado oil, macadamia nuts. Coconut oil is great for cooking. You don't ever want to cook with seed oils or vegetable oils because they oxidize so quickly. High levels of linoleic acid, again, a disaster. Processed foods full of linoleic acid. So yeah, the bad fats are they come along with sugar in these processed foods. Yes.
Yeah. And so that kind of leads us into the good fats. And then I do want to touch on the ketogenic approach and its impact on brain health. And better burning ketones than glucose.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, good fats we need a certain amount of good saturated fats from pastured animals, if possible, or if you're vegetarian, then, certainly olive oil would be a big source. Coconut oil would be good. Even chocolate, if you do it without sugar, stearic acid is good for you. Chocolate can be kind of a health food as long as you're monk fruit sweetened or stevia sweetened.
Okay.
So that's one, is neurogenic. We also want ketogenic or low carb. Now, 80% of Americans have some degree of insulin resistance because there's so much sugar. right? We eat a lot of sugar, and eventually that creates insulin resistance, which eventually leads to or can lead to diabetes. Mm-hmm. It's an obesity epidemic in this country, as well as a diabetes epidemic in this country. It's estimated that pretty soon a third of the population is going to have diabetes if current trends continue. Even if you're not diabetic or even pre-diabetic, the higher your insulin level, the higher your blood sugar level, the faster your rate of cognitive decline. So a really good test for everybody to do when you get your yearly physical, it's called the hemoglobin A1C.
Okay.
If you're over 5.0, you want to bring it down. There's almost no physicians who will say it's a problem if it's 5.3 or 5.5. It's not till it starts getting up to 5.8, 5.9 into the pre-diabetic range that most physicians will go, no, watch it here. In fact, every 0.1 increase over 5.0 leads to a steeper rate of cognitive decline. So if you're up there over 5.0, then you want to reduce it. And the way you reduce it is by reducing carbohydrate intake, because all carbohydrates eventually turn into sugar and glucose. Glucose, as you were alluding to, is a pretty dirty fuel, right? It produces inflammation, produces oxidative byproducts. And the brain can operate either with glucose as fuel or with ketone bodies, which are fats as fuel. And ketones are a very clean fuel, a very efficient fuel. Richard Veach, a researcher at Harvard for many years, looked at how ketone bodies affected cellular metabolism, and particularly the mitochondria. And he discovered that the mitochondria of the heart operate at 26% greater efficiency when they're using ketones as fuel versus glucose as fuel. Since the mitochondria of the brain are similar to that of the heart, it's theorized that the brain will also operate at a higher level. And if you've ever been in ketosis, that's how it feels, right? When you enter in nutritional ketosis, which is blood levels of 0.5 or above, there's a kind of clarity, there's a kind of stability, and there's a sense in which you have just sort of greater capacity cognitively. Things sort of open up. It's quite a wonderful feeling. So I think that while not everybody needs to do a ketogenic diet, if you are becoming insulin resistant, which is being called in some quarters carbohydrate intolerance, then you need to reduce your carbohydrates, right? In the same way that if you're lactose intolerant, you don't eat lactose. If you're carbohydrate intolerant, the idea is to cut way down on carbohydrates so you become insulin sensitive once again. And you can also do exogenous ketones, which will help your brain. Your brain prefers ketones over glucose as fuel. It will preferentially use ketone bodies over glucose because it just operates better on that and that cleaner fuel.
So what are some of the exogenous sources for ketones? Supplements, things of that nature?
Yeah, there's MCT oil, although most people have to work up slowly to that. There's C8, which is the most powerful part of MCT oil, and it almost immediately turns into ketone bodies. And there are various supplements available that are forms of beta hydroxybutyrate, which is one ketone body. There's a number of products coming on the market more and more, providing exogenous ketones. You can take them to raise your ketone level that way. You don't get the full metabolic benefits as you do as if you're producing ketones endogenously within your own body, but you get a lot of those effects. And so it can be a help to people who are kind of making that transition or who are simply wanting to use more ketones for fuel.
Any concerns that you've found with the ketogenic diet? And along with that, incorporating intermittent fasting along with the keto diet?
Sure. Intermittent fasting is a great idea. If you can keep your window to 6 or 8 hours for eating, That allows autophagy to kick in, and that also is a boost to your neurogenic rate when that happens. Long-term effects, it's funny. It seems like many people, and I experienced this myself, after 4 years of being on a strict ketogenic diet, I found that actually my hemoglobin A1C began to rise a little bit. So long-term, many people find that it has the paradoxical effect of, although it initially lowers your blood sugar levels, then it slowly begins to raise them again. And so what has happened is there's kind of a movement towards cyclical ketogenic diet. So once or twice a week, I will do a carb day. And it turns out my hemoglobin A1C went even lower than it had been before. So I think having your body cycled through things is always helpful, because the body is very adaptive. It adapts to whatever we do. And so even if you're taking supplements regularly, it's good to probably take a few off days just to have your body begin to kind of not get used to something and not downregulate something that it would otherwise, be producing well.
Boy, that makes a lot of sense to me. Back in my early days in my doctorate study, I came across a doctor that recommended cycling nutritional supplements and eating seasonally. When strawberries are in season where you live, eat strawberries, but don't eat strawberries that are in season somewhere else. That same kind of cyclic kind of approach. And when you look at keto and paleo and the different approaches out there, I think they all have great elements. And I really like what you're saying there. I think it's good to incorporate elements, not be exclusive a lot of times.
And I think a lot of it is simply guided by your hemoglobin A1C. If you have a low hemoglobin A1C and you're young, you can eat sugar, at least for a while. And so carbohydrate restriction is not necessary. It's only if people are compromised in that regard. And, Alzheimer's is now being referred to in some quarters as type 3 diabetes, that it's a problem with glucose metabolism. And so one of the main treatments with Bredesen's protocol, for example, is a ketogenic diet.
Yes.
When people are using ketones as fuel, the brain comes back online rather than trying to use more sugar for fuel.
Yes. I like that book, How to End Alzheimer's by Dr. Dale Bredesen, is I think what you're referring to there. And it is, it's just coming back to trying to get as close to good quality nutritional approach, keto kind of approach. And now it kind of leads us into the conversation about the third step, anti-inflammatory diet.
Yes, that's right. So inflammation, as you know, is also a big problem. Inflammaging is one of the causes of aging. And it's known as the silent killer, right? Because we don't notice it.
Sure.
Mechanisms to sense it. But when our inflammatory levels rise, every organ system suffers, including the brain. And some of the brain symptoms include emotional difficulties. So anxiety, for example, is very often an inflammatory process. Depression is almost always an inflammatory process. Alzheimer's, of course, inflammatory levels are off the charts. So there are a number of nutrients, number of supplements we can take, which are natural anti-inflammatories, foods we can eat that are anti-inflammatories, and foods we want to stay away from that are highly inflammatory. And some similar culprits here. Deep fried foods, highly inflammatory. Never want to do them. Sugar, highly inflammatory. And some of the anti-inflammatory things would be some of the same things that are also neurogenic. Omega-3s, particularly EPAs we talked about, green tea extract, curcumin or turmeric, a super anti-inflammatory. One of the best things you can do to lower your inflammatory levels. It's not well absorbed, and so it's helpful to do either pepper extract, piperine with it, or to micronize it, to do very, very small particles so it's absorbed better.
Okay.
Or to do it with phospholipids, like, for example, egg yolks. That increases the absorption by like 8 times.
Okay.
And then the final one would be gut friendly, right? Turns out that there are a number of bacteria which have been shown to exist in highly anxious people or depressed people, or have been shown to cause cognitive decline. They did one interesting experiment where they took mice who were genetically bred to be anxious and mice that were genetically bred to be fearless. And they exchanged the microbiome of each. So the fearless mice's microbiome went into the anxious mice and they became fearless. And the microbiome of the anxious mice went into the fearless mice and they became anxious. So it was like the microbiome trumps genetics here, or at least it pulls those epigenetic switches responsible for those responses. So the book goes into a number of different probiotics that have been shown to decrease anxiety, depression, and cognitive scores by 50%. So
that's pretty amazing.
It is. It's quite amazing. And what we also want to do is increase microbial diversity, because we have in indigenous cultures, they've got about 20,000 different strains of bacteria, right? We've got about as many bacteria as we have cells in our body. They used to think we had way more, but they've done a recount recently, and they think we have about the same, about 40 trillion cells in the body and about 40 trillion bacteria. And of that, in indigenous cultures, they've got 20,000 strains. In the West, we've got 10,000 strains on average, or sometimes as low as 500 or even 1,000 in very immune-compromised people. So the microbiome is the first line of our immune system. Something like 80% of our immune system is the microbiome.
Yes.
As diverse a microbiome as possible, right? Diversity it's always a good thing.
Absolutely.
Ecology, particularly, it's a good thing, because the more diverse the ecosystem is, the more resilient it is. So the more of an immune response we can mount if we have a greater diversity in our immune system. So we want to increase microbial diversity. We want to heal the tight junctions. And so we want not only to do probiotics, that is good, but it's only taking in 1 or 2 or 5 or even 20 strains. We want to increase by hundreds. So walking in nature, any type of nature, you're just going to be inhaling hundreds of strains of bacteria and increasing your microbial diversity. Eating more fiber, right? Processed foods, which most Americans get most of their calories from, has very little fiber. Fiber is what these little guys need to eat. That feeds them. A high fiber diet begins to increase microbial diversity in really powerful ways. So we need to be eating more vegetables, cooked and raw, fruits, depending on our carbohydrate intake. Simply increasing fiber intake is a fabulous way to increase the health of the microbiome. You know, the obstetrician used to tell the pregnant woman, you're not just eating for one anymore. And it's the same here. You're not just eating for one, you're eating for 40 trillion.
That's really good. Yeah, and it again, it just speaks to the complexity of the human. You throw in about 390 trillion viral cells into that biome, and there you go. So we're walking around with about 466 trillion. I went and did some of these numbers things and came up with about 466 trillion cells, 40 trillion of human and 40 or so trillion of bacterial, and then a whole bunch viral. The complexity is just out of control. So, getting kind of close to wrapping up here. Any other kind of take home thoughts that you would like to say? Hey, if you're going to wrap it up into a couple of take home summary points, what would those be?
Well, I guess Eat organic would be probably the single most important thing you can do to reduce pesticide exposure. Eat as organically as possible. Eating meat that is not commercial meat, but which is pastured, grass-fed, wild-caught. Those things I think are huge. Aside from that, I think just the importance of lifelong learning for also increasing our neurogenic rate. When we learn new things, it stimulates the brain, and the brain makes new brain cells. So listening to this podcast has been a neurogenic boost for everybody who's listening.
That's
Continue
awesome.
this sort of thing, learning new things the rest of your life. It's one of the best things you can do for your brain.
And then maybe if you could touch on, and I know this is just not fair to kind of throw it in at the end here, but the emotional well-being and the spiritual well-being component, maybe a little bit of a summary statement on that as well, how important that is.
Yeah. Again, both are huge. There are two types of meditation or prayer practice which have been shown to increase the neurogenic rate. One is devotional prayer or devotional heart-opening meditation practices, and the other is mindfulness practices. Both of those have been shown to have a powerful effect on the entire length of the hippocampus, not just one side or the other. And we could go into that in great detail. It's actually quite fascinating, that research. And just emotionally, if you are in a stressful job situation or a relationship that is involved with either bullying or there's fear or there's a lot of anger, those kinds of toxic emotional situations are also toxic to the brain. And what a lot of brain research has shown over the last couple of decades, in some ways, it's just gotten to the point of common sense, but it's interesting that it also shows us that having loving, supportive relationships, being around people who really see me, who really get me, who really can affirm me, and where I don't have to put on an act in order to get their approval. Those kind of relationships are great for the brain, right? The brain thrives in loving relationships. Oxytocin, which is involved in love, is neurogenic, highly neurogenic. And those kind of relationships reduce stress. And when we reduce stress, the brain functions better.
Yeah, that's awesome. And anything new today in 2022? I know we were talking just a little bit about it was just recently, relatively in the mid 90s, where they found that the brain does have regenerative properties. Anything that's developed here in the last 5 years, new in the last 5 years on the science?
I think one thing that's been interesting has been showing how sleep is also important for brain health, right? The discovery of the glymphatic system in the brain, that when we sleep, brain cells actually shrink by 1/3 to 1/2, and the brain is bathed in cerebrospinal fluid. And the glial cells of the brain go around and just pull up the amyloid plaque that is developed and pull up the toxins that are developed during the day. That they didn't know how the brain cleaned itself for a long time because it kind of sits in its own system, sort of like an aquarium. But like an aquarium, it needs to be cleaned. And so it turns out that too little sleep seriously impedes this. Most people need 7 or 8 hours a night because most of this cleaning happens towards the tail end of our sleep cycle. And so when you wake up after just a few hours sleep and you kind of feel foggy and dirty, that's because your brain is dirty, right? If you don't sleep for one night, you increase the amyloid by something like 30% in just one day. There are measurable cognitive impairments which happen after one night of not enough sleep. You don't function as well on cognitive tests. So getting a good night's sleep is good for neurogenesis because you also have the melatonin, which also increases neurogenesis, and not sleeping enough reduces the neurogenic rate. So that's, I think, been a really interesting thing in just the last few years.
Development there. And the glymphatic system is the brain's version of the lymphatic system of the body.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, so how can we follow up with you? You do take patients, and I think that you do some coaching and other things.
Yeah.
So maybe share with that a little bit about that and how to follow up with you.
Yeah, sure. I have an online coaching consultation practice around brain health. People can get my books on Amazon. The site is brantcortright.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate all that you've shared today, and I know there's so much more. But thank you for sharing with us today.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay, everybody, I'll leave us with just a final, hey, be prayerful and be excited that your brain has the opportunity to heal and regenerate. Have a great day. Medical information has become tough to sort through. Between politicization, institutional bias, and mass media, it's become tough to find the things that lead you to getting healthy. The Unaverage Health Summit is a free online video event for people seeking natural methods to kill brain fog, eliminate bloating, blast fatigue, and live optimally. You'll get access to discussions with natural health experts like Dr. McCullough, Dave Asprey, Dr. Petros, Dr. Schaffner, and many others on the cutting edge of medicine. It's happening soon and only available for a limited time. Go to unaveragehealth.com to get your free ticket to this online event. That's unaveragehealth.com. Again, it's free and access is ending soon. This is a great opportunity for you to continue your journey to becoming the best health advocate you can have. Hope you take advantage of this.